Hello and welcome to our 8th session on the weighted average cost of capital and how that is incorporated in company valuation. Now the topics we're going to look at will get to get a basic understanding of what cost of capital is, and also move on to look at actual weighted average cost of capital, how to measure the capital structure to start with, calculate the required rates of return on the various components that make up our capital structure, calculate the WACC, interpret it, and then use that to value an entire business. Now, what is cost of capital? The cost of capital is the return that the firm's investment expected to earn if they were to put their money in that firm. In other words, it means that what I expect the firm to offer me so that I do not put my money elsewhere, but rather I put my money with the firm. Now that becomes a cost of capital to the firm, because then it means that that is how much they have to pay me to convince me to put my money with them. Now the capital structure is the mix of the long-term financing, that's usually the debt and equity financing that the firm chooses to employ to fund its operations and day-to-day investments. Now, let's take an example of Geothermal Incorporated that has the following capital structure. For its debt, it pays about 8%, and then for the equity component, it pays about 14%. Now, we want to know the costs of capital to this company. What it means is that we need to understand what the market value of its debt is, because it means that it is funded by debt and equity. So we need to know the value of the debt and equity. And then using the portfolio or the weighting framework, we know that 30% of its funding is from debt and 70% is from equity. So once we incorporate those two, then we're going to do 30% earning 8% and 70% earning 14%, means that the basic portfolio return or the cost of capital should be somewhere around 12.2%. However, we need to take note of something. Because equity normally has its return computed from after-tax cash flows, then it means that we also have to adjust for the after-tax status of the debt, because also interest payable on debt is tax deductible, meaning that because we get to pay the amount before taxes, the intrinsic value or the real value is less than what is normally quoted. So once we adjust for that, given that there's a tax rate of 35%, it means that debt will now cost us approximately 5.2 and not necessarily the 8%, because we are truly paying only 65%, that is less the 35% tax rebate on the 8%, and that brings us to 5.2%. When we adjust for that, also incorporating the weight or the distribution of the firm's debt and equity, we have the weighted average cost of capital for this firm as 11.4%, and that's typically how we come by the weighted average cost of capital, which is normally captured as the expected return on the portfolio of all of the firm's securities adjusted for tax savings due to interest payments. And so a company's cost of capital is typically the weighted average cost for debt and equity. Now, this is how we work it out. Now, in terms of the taxes, they are important because tax deductibility reduces the actual cost of debt. And so in the presence of higher taxes, debt becomes cheaper. And so these can be incorporated when making decisions on cost of capital issues. So now this is the basic formula for the weighted average cost of capital for a firm that is funded purely from debt and equity. So we can see that the debt value is weighted in relation to the total value of the firm, and then we adjust for the tax component on the debt. Then we sum up with the proportion of equity multiplied by the required return on equity. Once we put that together, we have our weighted average cost of capital. And this typically becomes the discount rate that is most appropriate to be used in valuing investments for the sake of making a decision on what is viable and what is not viable when a firm is considering alternate investments to undertake. So these are the 3 steps that you should consider when computing cost of capital. First and foremost, calculate the value of each funding point as a proportion of the firm's market value. Now, as much as possible, you are to use the market value, so you have to proxy the market value of the firm's funding segments. Then 2, you are to determine the required rate of return for each of the securities. And 3, then you are to calculate the weighted average after tax return on the debt and the equity components. Now let's look at how that plays out. So in this case, where we have a firm that has 3 sources of funding from debt, pure equity or common equity as we know it, or preferred stocks, then it means that this is what the average weighted average cost of capital frame is going to look like. So this is an example for you to look at and to work it out, so that if the firm is funded by debt, preferred stock and common stock, and the market values are given accordingly, 4, 2 and 6 respectively, and then the required returns are these, to determine the WACC for Executive Fruit Incorporated, then we have to look at the firm value, which is 4 plus 2 plus 6 gives us 12. Now we have to compute the required returns. And then we go to step 3, where we incorporate the weightings and adjust for taxes on debt, and then we are left with a weighted average cost of 12.3. Now let's begin to understand how to estimate. Now in estimating WACC, like I mentioned earlier, do not use the book values, but rather use the market value. It means that the value that the market or investors are willing to pay for today. Now, book values do not often represent the true value of securities on the market, and so may be misleading. Now, how to determine, therefore, the market value of debt is to look at the present value of all coupons discounted at the YTM, and that takes us to a bond valuation lesson, which will then be incorporated here. And then for the market value of equity, we look at the pricing of shares using the stock valuation that we did study in our previous sessions as well. Now, once we put those together, it means that we have the value of potentially bank debt, if there's any, long-term bonds, we know that, common stock, we know that, and then if there are any retained earnings that form part of common stock, we do that accordingly. So once we adjust that, so here we are measuring the capital structure, and then we're going to start. The long-term bonds pay 8% coupon. They mature in 12 years. So what is the market value if YTM, or the discount rate, is 9%? Once we do that, we realize that the market value of the bond is 185 and not necessarily the 200 we had. So we adjust that accordingly. And then we also do that for the incorporation for common stock. So once we put all that together, we can see that the weightings vary. And now with the new weightings, we may proceed to also compute. Now to determine the cost of debt, you use the YTM. To determine the common equity return, you can use CAPM, or you can use the dividend growth model, where you then solve for return on equity. And then when you also have the perpetuity case or preference shares, you use the no growth case for stocks, in which case then you can use the perpetuity computation to arrive at your R. Once you put those together, then it means that you can have your weighted average cost of capital, having computed the relevant cost for each of the funding sources. Now, the WACC is an appropriate discount rate only for a project that is literally a carbon copy of the firm's existing business funding. So in essence, each funding mode, depending on how it's funded, may actually call for a different weighted average cost of capital computation. And typically, in looking at that weighted average cost, our main focus usually is on the two costs of debt financing. The explicit cost is the rate that bondholders demand. The implicit cost sometimes has to do with the increase in return for equity. So because the more we take on debt, the higher the risk of bankruptcy. So equity holders are likely to demand more from us because their risk has been heightened. How do we then incorporate weighted average cost of capital? We should be able to therefore compute the free cash flows or cash flows to be made from the business, and then once we incorporate the relevant weighted average cost of capital, we can always then arrive at the value for a business. And so by incorporating the same principle as we would for valuing any kind of investment, be they bonds or stocks, we can look at the cash flows to be made over the economic life of the business. And this one is the present value over the entire horizon, which is similar to the value of a stock given a certain constant level of growth. So once we are able to determine this, we determine the free cash flows up to that point like we do for stock valuation. And incorporated, it tells us the value that we can arrive for the sale of a firm. And so then that's the relevance as far as incorporating your weighted average cost of capital into capital budgeting and the valuation of businesses for the purposes of sales or for the purposes of issuing capital on the market for sale like stocks and etc. Thank you very much. We have come to the end of our session.